The moment it happened, it didn't feel like a confrontation or even a negotiation, but rather like the quiet crossing of a line that had been invisible until it was suddenly, irreversibly behind them. Because when looked across the table and said, with measured calm and absolute certainty, "We will not comply before we roll the footage. Just one thing, if you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe." Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now enjoy the video. She believed she was defending a principle that had defined Europe for decades. Yet in that same instant, she unknowingly activated a sequence that had already been designed, calculated, and patiently waiting for exactly that response. And as leaned back slightly, allowing a slow, controlled smile to settle across his face, the room did not erupt into argument or outrage, but instead fell into a deeper, more unsettling silence, the kind that signals not disagreement, but conclusion. There had been no cameras outside that morning, no carefully staged arrival, no choreographed handshake designed to reassure the world that the transatlantic alliance remained intact, because this meeting had been stripped of every symbolic layer that normally protects diplomacy from its own consequences. And the invitation itself had arrived through channels so quiet and so unusually direct that even seasoned officials in Brussels admitted in private that it felt less like an offer and more like a summons, something that demanded attendance but did not promise respect. In the weeks leading up to that moment, her team had prepared as though they were heading into a high-stakes negotiation, assembling dense briefing materials filled with trade data, defence contributions, and economic interdependence models drawn from institutions like and academic projections from, rehearsing counter-arguments deep into the night, refining language, testing scenarios, and anticipating pressure from every possible angle. Yet all of that preparation rested on a single assumption that would prove catastrophic, because they believed they were entering a conversation whose outcome had not yet been decided, when in reality they were stepping into a process that had already begun. The Oval Office itself seemed subtly altered, not in any way that could be easily described or immediately identified, but in ways that every person present could feel, as though the geometry of the room had been adjusted to create a psychological imbalance, with the American side positioned deeper within the space while the European delegation remained closer to the exit, an arrangement that one advisor would later describe as a silent declaration of hierarchy. And as Trump stood without moving to greet her, allowing the seconds to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, it became clear that this would not follow the familiar rhythms of diplomacy. When the folder was finally placed on the desk and slid toward her, it carried none of the visual markers of importance, no seal, no classification, no official insignia. Yet what it contained was far more consequential than any formal document. Because inside was not a proposal or a draft agreement, but a figure, precise, calculated, and presented without explanation, representing what American analysts, reportedly working alongside officials connected to the E, had defined as the accumulated cost of decades of security guarantees and economic stabilisation, reframed not as shared history, but as outstanding obligation. Her response came immediately, and perhaps that was the moment that mattered most, because there was no hesitation, no visible doubt, only the firm assertion that Europe would not accept the premise being presented. And for a brief second, it might have seemed like the beginning of a standoff, the opening move in a prolonged negotiation, yet the reaction it produced revealed something entirely different. Because Trump did not argue, did not raise his voice. He did not even attempt to persuade, and instead simply acknowledged the statement as though it confirmed a hypothesis he had already tested. What followed did not unfold in the room itself, at least not visibly, because the real consequences began to appear outside it, first as whispers and then as patterns that were too consistent to ignore as financial analysts noticed unusual movements in European markets, particularly in sectors deeply tied to transatlantic trade, and within hours, reports began to circulate among journalists at organisations like and suggesting that a series of policy reviews had been quietly initiated in Washington, none of them dramatic enough to dominate headlines on their own, yet collectively forming a trajectory that was impossible to dismiss. The first tangible shift appeared in the form of a draft tariff structure that seemed almost too precise to be reactive, targeting specific industries across different European economies, with rates calibrated in a way that suggested detailed prior analysis as Germany's automotive sector faced the possibility of steep restrictions that would directly impact companies like Leyen, while France's pharmaceutical exports and luxury goods industries were flagged for reassessment under new valuation criteria, and Italy's industrial machinery sector found itself under similar scrutiny, creating a pattern that was difficult to interpret as coincidence. What made this development particularly destabilising was not simply the scale of the measures being discussed, but the way they were distributed. Because instead of targeting the European Union as a single entity, the pressure was applied unevenly across individual member states, effectively forcing each government to confront its own vulnerabilities at the exact moment when collective coordination would have been most critical. And as a result, the initial discussions in Brussels quickly shifted from unified response strategies to internal debates about national priorities. At the same time, a second and far less visible dynamic began to emerge within the financial system, as European banks started reporting subtle but persistent delays in dollar-denominated transactions, changes that were not officially announced or formally explained, yet were significant enough to draw attention from institutions such as the EY, which noted unusual friction in transatlantic liquidity flows, and raising concerns about the stability of a system that depended heavily on seamless access to the global dollar network. This was not a sudden shock that triggered immediate panic, but rather a gradual tightening that altered expectations as borrowing costs began to rise incrementally and bond markets responded with increasing sensitivity to any sign of instability, prompting warnings from economists that even small disruptions in financial access could have cascading effects across government budgets, social programs and long-term investment strategies, particularly in countries already facing fiscal pressure. Meanwhile, political reactions within Europe grew more fragmented as leaders struggled to interpret whether these developments represented a temporary negotiating tactic or the beginning of a structural shift. So with some advocating for a firm and unified counter-response while others urged caution, fearing that escalation could accelerate a process they did not yet fully understand. And as media narratives diverged across outlets like &E, public perception began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways, reflecting a growing sense that the underlying assumptions of the transatlantic relationship were being questioned. The third phase, however, introduced a level of uncertainty that extended beyond economics and into the realm of security, as reports began to surface. Initially unconfirmed, but later supported by multiple sources, including our indicating that a comprehensive review of US military positioning in Europe was underway, with language that suggested not merely adjustments or reductions, but a broader reconsideration of strategic commitments based on evolving national priorities. For countries like &E, where security frameworks had long been closely tied to American presence, the implications of such a review were difficult to assess in real time, while in larger states such as &I, internal debates intensified over the extent to which Europe could or should adapt to a changing strategic environment without relying on traditional assumptions. What made this moment particularly complex was the absence of a clear narrative from Washington, because without explicit statements or dramatic announcements, each development had to be interpreted through its effects rather than its intent, creating an environment in which uncertainty itself became a driving force, influencing decisions, shaping expectations, and accelerating shifts that might otherwise have unfolded more gradually. By the time von der Leyen returned to Brussels, the atmosphere within European institutions had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore, as discussions became more urgent, more fragmented, and more focused on immediate contingencies rather than long-term strategy, with internal documents outlining potential responses across economic, financial, and defence domains, yet all constrained by the same fundamental challenge, which was time, because whatever process had been set in motion did not appear to be slowing down. Globally, the situation began to attract attention from other major actors as analysts and assess the potential implications for international stability, trade flows, and alliance structures. By recognising that even subtle shifts in transatlantic dynamics could have far-reaching consequences for the broader global system, particularly in an environment already characterised by competition and uncertainty. And yet, despite the scale of these developments, the origin of the crisis remained remarkably simple, tracing back to a single exchange in a room where no cameras were present, where no official record captured the exact tone or timing of the words that were spoken, leaving the world to reconstruct events based on their consequences rather than their documentation, and raising questions that continue to resonate far beyond that moment. Was this an inevitable recalibration of a relationship that had been evolving for years? Or was it the result of a miscalculation that transformed a negotiation into a turning point? And if the foundations of long-standing alliances can shift so quickly under the pressure of changing priorities, what does that mean for the stability of the systems built upon them? Because if this was not simply a dispute, but the beginning of a broader transformation, then the most important developments may still lie ahead, unfolding in ways that are not immediately visible, but will ultimately define the direction of global politics in the years to come, leaving one final and unsettling question hanging in the air. Was this the moment everything changed, or just the moment we realised it already had? Stay with this story, because what happens next may not be announced. It may not be explained, and it may not even be recognised until it is already impossible to reverse. And if you want to understand where this is going before the rest of the world catches up, make sure you're here for what comes next.